I think Russia will strike with nuclear weapons from Belarus into direction of Lithuania and Poland. And for Putin, this would be a hope that after this the West would surrender. The second possibility is not actually better than the first one. The second possibility is that they would transfer tactical nuclear weapons, as we know, as they promised, to Belarus first, and then they will start to move strategic nuclear weapons to Belarus.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we're talking to the American-Russian historian and writer, Dr. Yuri Felshtinsky. Famously, he wrote Blowing Up Russia, Terror from Within with the late Alexander Litvinenko. And his latest book is called Blowing Up Ukraine, The Return of Russian Terror. Really good to speak to you today. In your book, you examine the history leading up to this moment, to this war that we're facing. Did you see it coming? And if so, why?
I saw this coming from the moment Russia invaded Crimea in March of 2014. And it became clear to me that this is not an isolated episode of aggression, like a desire to have that particular peace territory, but the beginning of the implementation of a major program of expansion. And indeed, there were some signs. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. But again, the world saw that this is just an isolated case and not a part of huge program. In 2014, we've seen Russia invaded Crimea, of course, and then started actually a full-scale war on the east of Ukraine. And there was a particular plan of occupation to occupy at least partially Ukrainian territories and to unite them with Russia. And that's how it became clear, taking into account that Putin gave several speeches starting 2005, indicating that he's going to rebuild an empire. It wasn't clear whether this would be a Russian empire, a Soviet empire, something new. But again, it became clear that he's thinking in terms of territories, in terms of taking control of territories, first of all, of former Soviet republics. So that's why I think, to me, who is a trained historian, it became clear that we are just seeing a repetition of Hitler's attempts to take control of Europe in 1939.
And yes, and you argue in the book that you believe President Putin's ambition is to draw the world into World War III, a third world war, in order to establish this Russian empire. Some people will find that alarming and sensationalist. How do you respond to that?
Well, this is alarming, for sure.
I mean, what is the reasoning? How can you be so sure that that is the intention?
Well, first of all, I would be happy to be wrong. And the first article under the title World War III, I published 2 days after Russia invaded Crimea. So when Russia invaded Crimea, basically the majority of analysts and politicians again thought that that's where it's going to end, that Russia would take Crimea, which for one or another reason should belong to Russia, and that's where the aggression would stop. But it didn't, and Russia invaded Ukraine from the east. So that's again when it became clear that we are talking about possibility of a major war, because again this looked very similar to what Hitler was doing when he was trying to unite Germans within the border of one state. And from the moment when Russia invaded Crimea successfully, I have to say, because this was a very quick operation, again, a kind of German blitzkrieg, only one person was killed. And, we started to hear from Putin completely different speeches with a completely different tone. He was talking about Russian world. He was talking about special Russian gene. He was talking about uniting Russians within the border of one state. So it became clear that this is an ambitious program, which would be difficult to implement without a war, realistically, because there were some republics, like the Baltic states, for example, which would rather die than join the new Soviet Union or new Russian Empire. The same would be related probably to Poles, for example. And it was questionable, of course, those days how Ukraine would behave. But we realized very soon in spring of 2014, sorry, that Ukrainians are going to fight. And if the occupation of Crimea went quickly and without losses, the war for Donbass actually was very bloody, and it continued from 2014 until again February of 22 when Russia invaded again.
When Russia annexed Crimea 9 years ago, Belarus was firmly against this. And what we see happening today is a closening of relations between Belarus and Russia. We see the forming of a union state. We see them allowing Russia to effectively launch the invasion of Ukraine from their territory. And now we see that they're accepting Russian tactical nuclear missiles on their land. What on earth is going on here? What is the change in this relationship?
I think by now the Belarusian question or issue or problem is the major one, the most important one, I have to say. And here's the story. When again Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 and tried to take it very quickly and actually moved to Moldova, to Transnistria, where Russian troops are staying, and tried to organize similar, whatever, revolt or war there in Moldova, it became clear that this plan is not going to work. And it became clear to Putin, to Kremlin, to Russians. Because indeed, you should invade Ukraine from the north into direction of Kiev. But in order to do this, you have to control Belarus. So what we've seen after 2020, when Lukashenko lost elections, when the entire country was in protest, when they had to suppress these elections, these protests, with the help of Russian troops, by the way, which was sent from Russia to Belarus. And I have to stress that you cannot distinguish a Russian person from a Belarusian person. I mean, it's the same race, the same. It's not the same language because there is a Belarusian language, but every Belarusian speaks Russian. And Lukashenko actually lost control of the country and had to accept Putin's assistance. And from that day, he was not even an independent dictator. He was actually a puppet whose power was very, very limited if he has to fulfill the orders coming from Kremlin. And from 1920, by 1921, I mean, sorry, from
2020.
10, right, until 2011, Belarus was basically occupied by Russian troops. There were several agreements signed allowing Russian troops to stay in Belarus, to guard the western borders of Belarus, special agreements signed for Russian air bases in Belarus, etc. And then we started to see concentration of Russian troops, serious concentration of Russian troops in Belarus on the level of 100 to 200,000 people. And then, of course, it became clear that the invasion of Ukraine is going to start again. And this time it would be started from the north into the direction of Kiev, because again, the main purpose was to take very quickly Kiev, to install former President Yanukovych, who was living in Moscow after he escaped from Ukraine, and who now was transferred from Moscow to Minsk and was waiting for the order to come back to Kiev and proclaim presidency. So that's why Belarus became important in February of 22. And it stays important now because it's a major platform for Putin for not just invading Kiev again, if and when he decides to do this, because still you cannot proceed with the war in Ukraine without taking Kiev. This is impossible. And also as a geopolitical territory, unfortunately, from which now he could fire nuclear weapons into Europe, mainly Eastern Europe.
What do you think it would take for President Putin to use those tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus?
I think what we are going to see is the following. We will see the the movement of those weapons in Belarus. We have to say that some months ago and weeks ago, Russia already prepared Belarusian planes as Su-25 to carry those weapons, and Russian Iskander mobile rocket systems to carry again nuclear weapons, because they should be prepared for this special way. They train operators, they train pilots, and they're going to move it. Putin named 1st of July as the date when preparations for this would be done. So we should expect Russia to move nuclear weapons to Belarus after 1st of July. Here's the problem. There is a 1995 non-proliferation treaty, which Russia signed as well, which basically allows Russia to transfer nuclear weapons to any third country or second country, to any other country. That's why Russia is claiming that they are going to be controlling the nuclear weapons in Belarus, because if they would claim differently, then they would be in breach of that particular agreement. At the same time, they are going to put them on Belarusian planes, and those Iskanders, they are now part of Belarusian army, so Belarus actually owns them. So the moment this is done, Russia actually is in violation of 1995 non-proliferation treaty. I do not really think that this is a problem, meaning that Putin is worries too much about breaking an agreement, because this is not the first agreement which he is breaking. But then I think I really do not want to sound like a writer who creates particular scenarios. But we were facing Russians are very good, not Russians, the FSB is quite good in creating some hybrid scenarios for invasions or military actions. And we will see some explanations given to the world, which would indicate that those weapons were stolen or something like this. And Russia would try to minimize its responsibility for the use of those weapons. The tricky part is that we have to understand that the only reason Russia is moving those weapons to Belarus is to fire from Belarus. So the response would be against Belarus and not against the Russian Federation. Because if Russia would want to move these weapons just close enough to the borders of Europe, they would move it to Kaliningrad region, which is part of the Russian Federation, and then Russia would not be in violation of 1995 treaty, and Kaliningrad, of course, positioned much better than Belarus for striking against Europe. So the only reason for them to move those weapons in Belarus is to strike from independent state Belarus, so retaliation would be against Belarus and not against Russia. That's why I'm very, very worried.
And you get, however, in spite of what you're saying about the concern, the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, is saying that now everyone can have nuclear weapons. He's encouraging other countries to not abide by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. How serious a moment do you think this is? And how seriously should we take what he's actually saying?
Well, I do not really believe we should take seriously Lukashenko, because Lukashenko is not an independent person anymore. I'm not speaking about the fact that his health is probably not very good, and I do not really think that he's going to be around with us for a long time. And Lukashenko basically does not know what he's talking about. He was mentioning, of course, that Russia would transfer nuclear weapons to Kazakhstan as well. I doubt that Kazakhstan wants to have nuclear weapons, honestly. And Belarusians do not really want to have nuclear weapons. It's Putin who wants to install these nuclear weapons in Belarus, because again, for Belarus, this is a major provocation. Because if these nuclear weapons are used, then the retaliation will be against Belarus, and then Belarus might be destroyed, entirely destroyed, and millions of people might die in Belarus. But that's what Putin probably is planning to do, because he doesn't care how many Belarusians are going to be killed. Honestly, he doesn't care how many Russians are killed in this war between Ukraine and Russia. So this is a danger, this is a risk, this is a possibility that Putin actually is gaming for this kind of war, planning to kill millions of people.
You accuse the West of being naive, of making errors of judgment, of failing to understand what Putin is really about. Opportunities missed that you point out when Russia invaded Georgia in 2008 and annexed Crimea later. So what do you think should be done this time?
Well, it's not that I'm really accusing West, because again, I'm a historian and I know how the First World War was started and developed, how the Second World War was started and developed. And indeed, I think that this time we are doing much better as United Europe and the United States dealing with the new aggressions, and this was done. We were in much worse situation in 1936, 1939. I think generally there is an understanding what's happening. It's just the major decisions is probably very difficult to implement quickly, because we are talking about the union of 30 plus countries, which have to make major decisions in relations to Russia. But, well, yes, I would say that if the level of sanctions, those sanctions which we've seen after Russia invaded Ukraine in 22, would be announced against Russia in 2008, we probably would not see the invasion of Crimea. And it's the same. Those sanctions would be, announced against Russia in 2014. We probably would not see full-scale war of 2022. Probably, I do not know, because we are dealing with a unique situation, and this is important to understand. And this probably not too many people understand, that for the first time in history, and I stress that this is happening for the first time in history, the state security, which is the FSB now, runs a country. This never happened before. Never in history of the mankind, the state security, secret service would run a country. And this is extremely dangerous because Russia, of course, happened to be a nuclear power as well and a very powerful country. But this is, of course, dangerous because those people who were selected to work for KGB, which is now the FSB, these are very special people. These are not good people. Trust me, a good person would never go to work for KGB or the FSB. And they were never trained to build. They were trained to destroy and to kill. This was a job, this was a profession. They're quite good in what they're doing, and they sincerely believe that that's how the world works.
You argue that the only way to defeat Russia in Ukraine is for Ukraine to attack Russia on its own soil. And in recent days, we've seen a great increase in the number of drone attacks on Russia. How do you think that will be received? What do you think the effect will be?
Well, again, it's not that I'm arguing that Ukraine should attack Russia. That's not actually what I am saying. What I'm saying is that Ukraine is getting help from the West, and it's great and it's huge, but it's receiving it under the conditions that the Western weapons are not going to be used in strikes against the enemy, Russia and Belarus. And this allows Ukraine to conduct defensive kind of war. And we see that they do this quite successfully. But it doesn't allow Ukrainians to conduct offensive war. And if you think about this from military point of view and from strategic point of view, it is just impossible to win the war if you are not allowed to strike against enemy's territory. And since the major portion of weapons and contemporary weapons is Western-made weapons, the reality is that Ukrainians are not able to strike against Russians. So all destructions are done in Ukraine, and Russia does not feel the war at all. I have to stress one more thing. Russia is a huge country. We know this. But indeed, this is a country of one city. It's the only city which matters in Russia is Moscow. What happens in the rest of the country or with the rest of the country does not really matter. Moscow is the only important place. So yes, until Ukrainians have opportunity and possibility to strike against Moscow, Russia would not feel this war. And until Russia would not feel this war, there is no way Russia is going to stop this war or end this war. Because what happens in Ukraine, Russia does not feel at all. The destructions are in Ukraine. Yes, Russia is losing a lot of people. But again, Russia is a strange country which loses more people in any war than all other participants. So Russians are fine with this. Putin does not care how many Russians are killed. Indeed, more Russians are killed, the greater the war becomes. That's what he took from Stalin. You know, Stalin killed many Russians before the war, during the war, after the war, and he is considered by many Russians to be a great politician. So that's why, unless Ukrainians have permission from the Western leaders to fight this war with Western weapons, striking Russian territory, there is no chance they are going to win.
And yet the UK stands accused itself of conducting an undeclared war against Russia by the former president, Dmitry Medvedev. How seriously do you take that kind of rhetoric?
Well, Medvedev, of course, has no power at all. His only power is based on his personal relations with Putin. So I would say we should not really take seriously what Medvedev is saying, because again, no one stays behind him. But what's changed after 24th of February 22 is the following. Russia started this war as the war against Ukraine. And the idea was that they would take Ukraine very quickly and actually without losses. I'm quite sure that Putin actually did not plan to have a war. He was planning to see capitulation of Ukraine, and if not capitulation of Ukraine, then a very quick defeat of Ukraine. This did not happen, and as we know now, Russia is engaged in a serious full-scale war with another country. But the only change in the rhetoric is for Russia or for Russian leadership that instead of saying that they are fighting against the regime in Kiev, they are now saying that they are fighting against NATO. Because if you are not able to win the war against Ukraine, it's like it's a shame. But if you are fighting against NATO, like Medvedev once said, we are fighting against 800 million strong country, meaning that the entire NATO is fighting against Russia, then it's explainable why Russia is not able to win. So this isn't a change. But to say this, we have to understand that yes, Putin considers his activity starting 2008 and definitely 2014 and obviously 2022 as a war against NATO.
It is a very difficult and delicate time for NATO, isn't it? I mean, Ukraine wants to be an alliance member. All of its members want it to join. It's in the process of choosing its new Secretary General. How do you think NATO should conduct itself going forward?
I think NATO has no choice, honestly. I think the assistance to Ukraine will not stop because it's in the strategic interest of Europe to stop this war. And when this was started, everyone had the same idea to stop this war as quickly as possible by any means. And I really mean by any means. And I'm not even accusing those politicians like Macron, for example, who were ready to end this war through capitulation of Ukraine or through exchanging part of territories for peace. Again, the idea was to stop this war, but unfortunately, it became clear very soon that the only way to stop this war is to win this war, because Putin is not ready to stop. Putin is not ready to accept defeat, of course. And Putin is not ready to change the major program which he has for rebuilding empire. He wants the entire Ukraine, period. He wants Moldova, period. He actually wants the Baltic states as well. And then he would like to have the reestablishment of the influence which the Soviet Union had in Europe. That's what was said by Putin when after the war started. So that's what NATO is dealing with. NATO has no choice. It has no choice but to defend Ukraine or to help Ukraine. The only goal which probably everybody has now is to limit this war within the borders of Ukraine, or let's say borders of Ukraine, Belarus and Russia. It's questionable if we would able to hold this war within the borders of Ukraine, but I believe many people think that it's possible, and it might be possible.
You said earlier that the only way to stop Russia would be to make it feel the hurt in Moscow itself, in Russia itself. What about the Russian people? How do they feel about the war in Ukraine at the moment?
Uh, we do not know because the question how people feel something relates to countries which have a certain level of freedom and could express, where people could express their opinion. In Russia, this is not the case. Not talking about propaganda and not talking about absence of freedom of speech and press. So we really do not know how Russians feel. We have to understand that, and again, we do not know what the figure is, but we're probably talking about million or 2 million or maybe 3 million of Russians who left Russia after 24th of February 22 when they realized that it's going to be a major war, and who definitely either did not support this war or at least did not want to be part of it. So whoever stayed in Russia is either neutral about this war or is supporting this war. And of course, there is a certain percentage of people who are against this war but are not able to leave for one another reason, because the entire country would never be able, of course, to immigrate. This again never happened in history. So, but the problem is that Russian people do not really have any power and authority and voice in what's going on in Russia. There are no elections. Putin doesn't really depend on popularity or on support. He doesn't really care whether Russians are for this war or against this war. The borders are still open, by the way, what is interesting, because it seems to be that Putin prefers those people who do not support this war to leave Russia, dealing only with those people who are neutral about this war or support this war. So I do not really think we should expect any protests or confrontation between the Russian people and the government. I think this will never happen. And again, we know that in critical moments, like in Germany during the Second World War, again, the role of population probably was, mainly the population mainly was supporting the government and not protesting against the government.
You spoke earlier about the ambition to go beyond Ukraine for President Putin, but for the longer this war goes on, isn't there the possibility that actually the weaponry, the support for it, the financing, it's just not going to last, is it?
Well, when we look at this war from outside, it seems to be that Russians are doing poorly, and there is no way they're going to win this war. And they probably already lost this war and just do not know about this or just do not want to accept this. But this is not the look from inside. When you look at this war from inside, especially from Kremlin or from Lubyanka, you are saying, well, yes, this war takes longer than we thought. When we thought that this would be a blitzkrieg and by now we would be near the borders of Germany, but it takes longer. We are losing people, but we do not really care about people. But we do have nuclear weapons. And the West knows this, the West is afraid of this, and the West is going to surrender, or at least to surrender Ukraine to Russia, as soon as they understand that we are serious about using nuclear weapons. And again, that's why Putin is now moving these weapons to Belarus. This is a very powerful tool, both militarily and politically. But the idea, Putin's idea, is that if the West is still fighting against, this is not that the West is not frightened enough yet that Russia should move further That again, this is a very KGB kind of mentality, right? That if the person does not agree to do something, this means that you should beat him a little bit more. But that's precisely what Putin is doing, and that's precisely how he's thinking.
In that light, and you're no stranger to predictions on Russian politics and the future, what do you think will be happening this time of year?
I stressing that I sincerely hope that I am wrong, and this would never happen for one or another reason. I think Russia will strike with nuclear weapons from Belarus into direction of Lithuania and Poland. And for Putin, this would be a hope that after this the West would surrender. The second possibility is not actually better than the first one. The second possibility is that they would transfer tactical nuclear weapons, as we know, as they promised, to Belarus first, and then they will start to move strategic nuclear weapons to Belarus. And then the entire Europe will be in danger, and the level of danger actually would become even higher, because with tactical nuclear weapons, you would not be able to strike very far.
In the nicest possible of ways, I sincerely hope you're wrong. Dr. Yuri Felshtinsky, very good to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. Our thanks to our producer, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye-bye.